Welcome, I'm Thomas, and we'll explain you now the second of the important features of complex adaptive systems, which is feedback. Again, let's look back to traditional science. Interactions among entities in traditional science do not depend on past interactions. Again, we can look at the example of an apple at a certain height. Its motion rules will not change over time because the height has changed. What it is going to change because of the height might be the potential energy or the variables of the system, but the very rules of motion will not change, are fixed for the happening of the trajectory. Again, the evolution of traits in Darwinian evolution does not change the evolutionary rules in the same way that the position of the apple does not change the rules of motion of the apple. So, we have fixed rules describing the future of a system. The changes in the variables will change, of course, the way that the system evolves, but we will not change what defines the change. That's an important thing. The happening of the system, the unfolding of a certain situation, does not change the rules that describe such unfolding. That's traditional science. We can see, as I mentioned in the previous video, that the rules of change of the trajectory of the apple will not be modified by the very action of the apple falling. This is going to be the same. So feedback is something that happens in complex systems, and it is the change of the very conditions that define the interactions by the happening of those interactions. So it's a sort of, that's why it's called feedback, because the very action fits back into what the system is going to do next. A typical example of feedback is a decision-making process in a modifiable environment, actually our daily life. We make our decisions, and according to the results we get on our decisions, we modify the decision-making process for the future. Well, sometimes we don't, but we are expected to do it. So, the typical description of this is, okay, we have a decision that implies an action. That action will change the state or the conditions of the system, which allow us, or we will get new information about the state of the system, we will decide again, and we will act again. Think about eating. I'm hungry, so I will eat. That's my action. What's the state of the condition of myself again? I get information about it, I'm still hungry. I'll eat more. Then changing the condition of the system, two possibilities. I will eat until I'm full, or I will eat until the dish has no more food. These two things are feedback from my decision. It's not that I will be eating and eating and eating and no stop, or I will stop because of an external variable. No, I stop because I am full or because I deplete the plate. So there is a feedback between the system and its environment. That's a very simple, typical example. You can apply it to everything, to all the decisions in your life. These are always feedbacking. You're a feedback machine. We are all feedback machines. And that's interesting to think about life. And we will do that maybe a little later in the course. An important feature of feedback, to understand what feedback is about, is that it can be of positive or negative nature. This is not normative in the sense of good and bad. It's in the sense of amplifying or reducing. So, negative feedback is that the consequences of the action decrease the occurrence of the action. So that's normally regulation. So if it goes too high, it's going to go down. I mean, the consequences of the action oppose the occurrence of the action. Not decrease, it's better, more precise to say oppose. Decrease is written there, but it's called for regulation. And positive feedback, consequences of the action will foster the occurrence of the action or increase. So that's normally understood as indefinite growth. So the examples of positive and negative feedback here are very typical. I will start with the positive feedback loop, which is more the simplest, then the B in the slide. And you have the motivation and success. If you have motivation, you probably will find success, which in turn will give you more motivation, which in turn will give you more success, and so on and so forth. And that's described for psychology, for trying to make people understand that motivation is necessary for success as much as success is necessary for motivation. So this is the way in which you can escape, for example, a frustration process through motivation. Whereas negative feedback loop is the typical relationship between praise and predators. Now you must imagine, this is typical complex systems thinking in ecology, which we will also cover a little bit in this course. You must imagine a world where there are two types of animals only, let's say wolves and rabbits. The wolves eat the rabbits. We don't care about how rabbits grow, they eat grass, which is kind of infinite for our assumptions. And we'll try to look at the interplay between the number of prey and the number of predators, the number of rabbits and the number of wolves. So if you have too many rabbits, predators, wolves, will be plenty of food. So they will start eating all the rabbits and they will reproduce a lot. So there will be at some point so many wolves and there has been eaten so many rabbits that the rabbits will start being too little for the number of predators. And that's what is represented by the minus sign in the down arrow. So the number of prey, the more you have, the more will be eaten by the predators. But the more predators are, the more you lose prey. So that creates a sort of regulation. Because when there are less prey, the predators won't have much food, so some of them will die, which will make that the prey again can reproduce more. And that's how there is regulation with feedback. And interestingly, feedback mechanisms are responsible for multiple phenomena and applications. I put in blue the regulation and in red the dispersion or positive feedback. So blue, negative feedback, red, positive feedback. Thermoregulation of the body. If our body is cold, it will have some mechanisms to heat it up, and if it's warm, it will activate some mechanisms to cool it up. Virus dynamics. When virus enters in the body, it starts reproducing more, and the more virus, the more reproduction, the more, and that's why virus tend to kill organisms in general, because they have this positive feedback. The more they are, the more they reproduce, the more cells they can hijack. Market regulation, for example, in economics, is a negative feedback. If you have different companies selling the same product, some of them will sell high, some of them will sell low, but those that sell too high will try to sell low, and those that sell too low will try to match those that sell higher. So then in this way, markets are supposed to regulate each other, which is not always true, but for simplifications it works. Whereas the crisis is when a certain happening in a certain market impacts in another market, which in turn impacts in another, and creates a crisis that propagates only positively as a positive feedback mechanism. So if, for example, there is a particular problem with producing metal, for example, and you need to buy the road, you cannot buy the road, but you can and if you don't have the road, you cannot transport whatever you need to buy more roads, so you enter in a positive feedback loop, increasing the crisis in economics. And public policy, for example, it's a way to regulate the beliefs of people that things are good or bad. So public policy generally is made to control the riots or the problems that a society is facing. They say, okay, now we will do this because people need this. So they try to regulate the vital behavior of people, that they all think that things are wrong. So public policy tries to, let's say, put things in place so they can, people can live their lives without complaining that much. Whereas propaganda has the aim of dispersing and putting people all to think the same way. So they all have to think on who to vote. So they are designed so that people can transmit the same message. Whereas public policy and riots have a regulatory dynamics. The more riots, the more public policy, the less riots. And then less riots imply less public policy. And that's how it actually works. And this is the particular or the typical feedback, let's say, device. This has been, it's called control theory, theory of control. So, and the typical example is the thermostat, which regulates the temperature of a certain room. It can put heat in or put cool it up, so that you have something that can throw hot or cold air inside the system, and the system measures the temperature that wants to reach. If it's above the reference value, will throw cold air. If it's below the reference value, will throw hot air. So then you have this controller that commands the effector, which is actually the action, that then brings in the air, and again you measure, not you, the thermostat will measure the temperature and will make a decision what to do, more hot air or cold air. And you see for some time it's cold, and then it stops. And then when it starts becoming too cold, for example, we'll start throwing hot air in until it warms up, and then we'll start throwing more cold or more hot depending on the environment. But that's how the thermostat works. So it's always feedbacking and deciding whether it will do a positive or negative influence in the system.